think on the bright side of things a lot of the time, and I don't let it get me down in that sense. That's how I get by each day, I think, is just waking up with the attitude, I'm alive, I'm well, and I can breathe and I can move.
I've really just devoted my career the last decade into ensuring that I can create a more fair, more equitable world for other children and young adults in families where there's illness or disability or mental illness or substance abuse.
That was Darline and Feylyn Lewis. Darline Lewis spent her days and nights helping bring new life into the world as a labor and delivery nurse working at Memorial Hospital in the Nashville area. Health challenges surfaced late in her career, and she suffered a botched spinal injury that ended her nursing career. 20 years later, she had a stroke due to a medication area that caused paralysis, apraxia, and lymphedema. Today, she uses a wheelchair. Now life has come full circle for her as the daughter she welcomed into the world more than 3 decades ago has now stepped in to help care for her. The aha moments for these two as a team have been eye-opening as more and more children are having to and wanting to step in to care for their older family members. As we might imagine, this is a roller coaster of emotions and obstacles. Let's let them tell us about their lives.
I'm Sally Hussey, the CEO of 50 Forward, and we elected to launch this podcast because we know older adults have such inspiring stories and wisdom worth sharing. We have now all learned that social connections are critical to our well-being. This podcast is made possible by 50 Forward, the leading resource for adults 50 plus in Middle Tennessee who seek to live longer, more fulfilling lives.
You're listening to Squeeze the Day, where we talk to extraordinary people over the age of 50 who are living their best life now. Their stories of a well-lived life are both inspiring and encouraging to all of us as we seek to navigate a meaningful and purpose-driven second chapter in our life. Today's Squeeze the Day is brought to you by the All of Us Research Program from the National Institutes of Health. Learn how you can help change the future of health by participating in the program. Visit www.joinallofus.org to learn more. I'm Susan Sizemore, Communications Director for 50 Forward, so let's get started. Welcome, Feylyn and Darline.
Hello.
Hi.
So this is a first for us to have 2 guests, and we're actually especially doing this to tell the story of Darline Lewis with the help of her daughter, Feylyn. This is an important story to share about motherhood, careers, and a bit about youth caregiving, as well as the challenges and victories you have had together. Thank you both for joining us today, and we're excited to also be doing this so close to celebrating Mother's Day.
We're excited to be here. Thank you for having us.
So my first question is for Feylyn. Dr. Feylyn, you're an academic, you're currently studying youth caregivers, and now you're helping your mom, Darline, in life and in this interview because she has apraxia. Can you tell us a bit about that? And how is it different from aphasia that many people now have heard about due to Bruce Willis's recent diagnosis?
Sure. Aphasia is an acquired communication disorder, and that means that it's something that happens during the course of life rather than being present from his birth. And it affects the person's ability to process language, but it doesn't affect intelligence. Now, my mother, as a result of her stroke, she was diagnosed with apraxia, and apraxia is a cognitive disorder that can occur after a stroke. And it's the inability to make purposeful movement, but it's not due to sensory or motor disturbances like loss of sensation or muscle weakness. There are different types of apraxia, and my mother has the type that affects her speech. And it can be difficult for her to get her words out, but she comprehends just fine.
The most important thing to me is that I know what I want to say, but sometimes I just can't get it out. So everything is there cognitively, but I just can't get the words out to express myself, and that's quite frustrating.
That has to be very frustrating. And I know a bit about your background, but I'd like you to share with your listeners. Tell us a bit about your career, and I also want to know about your most unusual handle for email. Do tell us.
Well, I find it interesting that Feylyn is now doing caregiving because I grew up as a caregiver of my mother. So that's why I went into nursing, because as a child, my mother was ill a lot. And I just remember when my grandparents and my father would go to the hospital to see her, I couldn't go in to see her. And I always wanted to go behind those doors. And I would just remember hearing the clank of the doors shut, and I couldn't go behind those doors. And as a little girl, I always thought, I'm going to become a nurse so I can always go see my mother. So I didn't want anything to
Oh,
prevent me from seeing my mother. So that's what drew me into nursing, because I always wanted to be able to go see my mother. And so I find it interesting that now Feylyn is in the position of taking care of me like I was taking care of my mother when she needed me to help her. And so, as a result of that, I became a registered nurse. And when I was married, I was a military wife. And so I got to travel around, and I worked in various hospitals and in different areas of the hospital. So I ended up in OB because when I was in Kansas, they needed an OB nurse. And I tried to tell the nurse, well, I don't know anything about OB. I'm a med surg nurse and I work ICU. But she said, well, you'd be perfect for OB because you have all those skills. And of all the times I took Feylyn to the interview with me, and I always tease her about this. Feylyn used to cry everywhere I would take her. During this interview, she was as quiet as a mouse. She slept right through it. So I couldn't get out of that job. That's how I ended up in OB, because Feylyn kept quiet during the interview.
what a beautiful story, and what a really interesting family situation. So loving, so caring. And the very fact that being a nurse kind of opens the door to get in when perhaps other
Yes.
times you could not, I think is a really interesting perspective, and a very loving and giving perspective. So your unusual email handle, Darlene Be the Great, I still have to ask about that.
Well, as a little girl, before the internet was even invented that I was aware of, when I was really young, I used to run around the house saying, I'm Darlene Brown the Great. And so I would always tell my sister and brother that. And so when the internet came along, I thought, I know what my handle is going to be. And so somebody had the Brown part. So I thought, well, I can just be Darlene B. the Great. And so that's where it came from my childhood playing around with my name.
That is tremendous. And I'm going to say that is what we today call visioning. And you visioned it, you dreamed it, you became it, and look what we got.
Yes.
It's lovely. So my next question is for Feylyn. Caring for one another as a family is nothing new to you. Growing up, your older brother helped you and your mom because of some of the health challenges she had long ago. Can you tell us more about that?
When I was 11 and my brother was, I guess around age 17, 18, my mother was diagnosed with degenerative disc disease. And that means that the kind of the spongy part of her spine, it shrinks and deteriorates, and that causes her severe pain. So she actually had a surgery to help alleviate that. But unfortunately, the surgeon at the time took out bones from her spine that he shouldn't have. And that left my mother permanently disabled. And as you know, she was a registered nurse, but she actually had to stop working and now collect disability because of the effects of that botched spinal surgery. And for me and my brother, he expected to just be home for that weekend of the surgery. But because it went wrong, he actually ended up dropping out of college. He was going to Tennessee Tech at the time, studying engineering, came home and stayed home indefinitely. And it just became, again, what we thought might have been a weekend, many, many years now, into decades of caregiving for myself and for my brother. And for my brother at 19, he took on paying rent and mortgage, got a job, cooking, cleaning, taking me to school. And for me in the home as at 11 and, growing up as a teenager and young adult, that also meant things like helping my mother with intimate care, like helping her shower and bathe and get dressed, and wound care when she had some corrective surgeries in years following. So for us, we didn't know any other child or young adult who had caregiving responsibilities like ourselves. For myself, definitely lonely and isolated, and we thought we were the only caregivers out there.
That's such an interesting story. And bless you, Darlene, for raising such tremendous children. So, Darlene, let's talk a little bit about some of the health challenges that led you, that maybe that Feylyn didn't touch on, that you're dealing with today, and then how you stay optimistic through all of this.
Well, the reason I'm in here with the stroke at present condition of the stroke is because I realized my blood pressure was elevating. And so I thought, well, I'll go to the hospital so they can help me get it down because it was dangerously high. I knew that. But going in to get that done, the medication they gave it too rapidly. And that's what caused the stroke. And so here I am trying to prevent a stroke and end up in the hospital where the medication they gave me, it was given too rapidly, caused the stroke. And so that's why we're in this situation now. So it kind of threw me off because I'm thinking, I go to the hospital to get help and I'm a nurse. Why can't I just get help and go back home normally? But the perspective I take is that I think understanding the medical side of it, I don't like the way it happened to me because I am part of the medical community. But on the human side, it's disrupted my life completely. Both surgeries interrupted my life completely. So I stay optimistic because each day I get up and I can get around and do what I want to do, not as freely as I was before the stroke, apparently. But I think on the bright side of things a lot of the time, and I don't let it get me down in that sense. So that's how I get by each day, I think. It's just waking up with the attitude, I'm alive, I'm well, and I can breathe and I can move so as much as I can with the stroke. So that's how I'm making it about, in my life right now.
That's really beautifully stated. Feylyn, I want to ask you a little bit more about your personal life and the experience that you've used to dictate your career direction. I know you hold a doctorate in social work and a master's in health counseling. I want you to share a little bit about your academic background and how you and your mom are finding rich ways to tell your story across the globe and to some very interesting audiences.
For me, definitely, I view my career as one where this was something that was completely catastrophic for my family in terms of the physical impact that my mother had now with two disabilities, but also emotional impacts, financial impacts. It's been such a tremendous hit to our family. But I view really what I do now doing research and advocacy for young caregivers, so children, young adults, millennials who also have caregiving responsibility, as one, a way to honor what the sacrifices that my older brother made. I wouldn't be at any place at all of what I do now if it wasn't for him. The sacrifices that he dropped out of college so that he could come home and take care of myself and my mom. And for me, I view every single thing that I do as a way really to honor what he did, but also to ensure that other children like myself or other young adults like my brother are not in that position the way that we were. So I've really just devoted my career the last decade into ensuring that I can create a more fair, more equitable world for other children and young adults in families where there's illness or disability or mental illness or substance abuse. And I left Nashville and the US about 8 years ago to study in the UK. The UK is about 30 years advanced from the US in terms of research, policy, and practice for youth caregivers. And so I went abroad so that I could learn from the models, learn the research, learn about all the hundreds of supportive organizations they have there in the UK so that I could one day bring it back. And so that's what I've ended up doing. And now I'm back in the US so that I can take what I've learned to continue to be an advocate for other children, young adults in my home country.
That's so cool. And I find it interesting that, the comparison between the United States and other countries. And I'd love to ask a question that we really haven't talked about much, but can you just touch for a moment about the difficulties of senior housing? And specifically, you can speak to Nashville because I know you and your mom just went through this. If for no other reason, it was an aha moment for me to hear you say what you encountered and the difficulties in being able to live together as a caregiver caring for an older adult.
So my mother suffered a stroke September 2020. And when I got the news, I immediately flew from London back to Nashville that very next day. And knowing then that she started to lose movement on the right side of her body, she was now going to need to use a wheelchair. We knew that the housing that she currently had would not be suitable for her. She needed wheelchair accessible housing. And I also quickly realized that I needed to move back from England to be her full time caregiver as well. So that meant I needed to live with her. My mind was completely blown by the lack of senior living in terms of being able to live with a caregiver. So, anywhere that we would find in Nashville, they would certainly be able to take my mother as someone who's over 60 or disabled, but they would not be able to take me as her live in caregiver because of my age. So, I'm in my almost now mid 30s, and I was too young. And I thankfully, though, found one older person's community who said, that's fine, you can come in. They were based in Madison and they were wheelchair accessible, had grab bars in the bathroom, everything that my mother needed for suitable accommodations for housing. But unfortunately, she actually in January this year, so January 2022, she had a bit of a setback and ended up in one of our local hospitals. And while I was in the hospital, I came home to switch out her clothes and saw this note about we were going to be evicted. The entire community, a developer came in and bought up the senior living community, and we all had to leave within about 6 to 7 weeks. And this was such a shock to receive because one, the letter had been sitting there because I'd been at the hospital staying there with my mom, but then also to know that these are older persons, these are disabled people. And if they did not have a caregiver like me or did not have family in the area, what were they going to do? So we had to, or really myself, not only was I, going to the hospital and then going to the skilled nursing facility where she was in the day, but also then starting this extensive search for accommodations that would be suitable for someone in a wheelchair. And unfortunately wasn't able to find that in Nashville. And I think that really speaks to the lack of adequate housing for our seniors in Nashville, but also I think speaks to me what I see kind of the greed that's happening with developers coming in and taking in what we do have in Nashville, and that's simply just not a viable option anymore.
It's a troubling situation in the name of progress, but it's what we're dealing with. Question for Darline. As a nurse and a mother, what is the effort that Darline is making now to kind of build awareness and also advocate for older adults and youth caregivers mean to you?
Well, I love that she's getting the word out there about youth caregivers because, as she was saying before, when her and her brother were taking care of me and I was discharged, no one asked who was in the home with these young people that they were sending me home with. And so, with that, they didn't know if my children had resources to take care of me or not. So, with her getting the word out there, maybe now when people are sending family members home with people, maybe they'll inquire who's actually at home. What are the ages of the people you're sending these children, the ill person home with, or the recovering person home with, to make sure that if they are young caregivers, that they have the resources to fulfill the obligation of taking care of those people. So I think it's really good that she chose to study this field based off of what her and her brother went through in caring for me. So that there's awareness so that other young people will now get the resources. And then even healthcare providers and others will ask questions more of what happens when these people go home, who's taking care of them, and what resources do they have, and are they going to be successful in the person's recovery. So I'm really proud of what she's doing in getting the word out in regards to youth caregivers.
I think advocacy is so important. And certainly if there are family members that can step in and are willing to step in, you've got the best of everything because they're most closely aligned with the patient. Feylyn, I want to talk a little bit about youth caregivers and multi-generational caregivers. Tell us a bit about that and what you've learned and whether the pandemic escalated the need.
I wish I could say I had great news to share, but unfortunately, with the COVID-19 pandemic, recent research has shown that there have been about a 25% increase of youth caregivers since the pandemic. So that may be because maybe other health conditions maybe have been exacerbated or have not been treated during the pandemic, but also issues like long COVID meaning that if their parent or grandparent or sibling, is still experiencing symptoms because of a COVID diagnosis, they're now, as a child, stepping into a caregiving role. So I think also in terms of multi-generational caregivers, I love to think of care as something that's just and mutual and interdependence. So I always like to think, even though I am my mother's caregiver, and certainly that, as a child and now as a millennial, she also continues to care for me too, even as my mother. Care goes both ways. We depend on each other. So I think of it for me as the love and duty I have as her daughter to care for her. But also, I recognize how it is not one sided. That care really does flow both ways. And that's really important, I think, when we talk about youth caregivers and caring for older persons, that we want to make sure that we're not being ageist or ableist. And I think that's how we recognize that there's so many diverse ways that we show love and bonds and care for one another in multi-generational families, even if, one person may have the label as a caregiver.
That's really well stated. And in some respects, I think older adults and the senior population, if you will, they're often overlooked these days.
Unfortunately. So, yeah. I always like to think too, if we can support older persons and disabled persons, or if they have both identities, that also helps uplift caregivers of all ages, including especially those that are marginalized, like children and young adults of those roles. So if we can tackle the needs of those who are the most vulnerable, that helps lift all of us up, really.
Darline, there's a question that we ask all of our guests, and it relates to maybe an older adult or a parent or someone in your past that gave you a piece of advice, and at the time you might have thought, oh, that's so silly, but now that phrase rings true in your everyday life. Is there something like that that comes to mind?
Well, the thing that sticks with me is that because we grew up in a multi-generational family, my grandparents and then my mother and then us, the one thing that they always tell all of us young people is be careful how you leave your home because you may have to come back. So be kind to the people you are living with currently. Because you may have to, a situation may occur where you have to come back home. So be kind so they let you come back home. So that's the one thing that's always stuck with me. And I try to pass on to my children and tell other people as well, be careful how you leave home. Because you want those people to invite you back into the home.
I think you both are doing a fine job with one another from what I can see today, and I appreciate you sharing your story. I have one more closing question that we ask all of our guests also, and it relates to the name of our podcast, which is Squeeze the Day. And so what is it that you do, Darline, to squeeze the day?
Well, I start my morning in prayer, so that helps me get my day going so that I can have a really, really good day.
That sounds like a good practice for all of us. So I want to thank you both for joining us today. What an amazing life of leadership you both are sharing, and we are witnessing from interviews and stories just like yours. Now we challenge everyone listening to go squeeze the day.